I'm Sara Khan from Glenbrook South High School in Chicago, Illinois, and my project is on Huda Shaarawi, the mother of modern Arab feminism. So for my presenter's promise, I would like to say that I promise that I'm not an expert, but I'm simply curious about this topic. So if I do make a mistake, you can contribute and correct me nicely. And I'm not trying to promote my personal agenda in any way. I just want to cultivate your curiosities. So the outline for my presentation goes as such. First, I'll talk about the shaping of Huda Shaarawi and her nationalist and feminist views. And then I'll discuss Shaarawi's role specifically in the Egyptian feminist movement in the 1920s. And then I'll talk about Shaarawi's legacy for Arab feminism. So the reason I'm curious about this is because I spent a lot of time studying Western feminism and gender theory, and I'm really interested in expanding my knowledge. And the other day I watched a TikTok on Kulthum, who was a really prominent singer in the nightlife of Cairo in the 1920s. And I just thought there must have been so many other revolutionary women during this arts and culture hotspot of human history in the 1920s, and specifically in Egypt. So I wanted to learn more about, the feminist movement in 1920s Cairo. So the question that I'm exploring is, what was Huda Shaarawi's impact in the 1920s Egyptian feminist movement? Okay. The first question you'll probably want to know is, who was Huda Shaarawi? In one sentence, Huda Shaarawi was a feminist leader, nationalist, and suffragette and political activist for women's rights based in post-colonial Cairo, Egypt. Huda was one of the first Egyptian women who argued for women's liberation, and this started with education, which would lead to full participation in not only social, but also cultural reform, and she believed it would result in social usefulness and legal and civic equality. So, because Shaarawi was a socialist feminist, she promoted a successful program for social change, not only within the existing social and political order, but also within the framework of Islam and its value system. So she was one of the most prominent feminist figures in the early 20th century. And she fought for women's rights in Egypt at a time of social and cultural reform, because it was during the time of Egyptian liberation from the British. Okay, so Shaarawi's early life. Shaarawi argued for women's liberation from a very early age. She was born in 1879 to an extremely wealthy family and daughter of politician Muhammad Sultan. And Muhammad Sultan was also the first president of the Egyptian Representative Council. So right out of the gate, Huda was born into an extremely political lifestyle. Because of this wealth that she was born into, she received an extensive education and spoke Arabic, French, and Turkish. However, her education was limited to the harem and the harem lifestyle of the early 1900s to 1919 Egypt, which was a secluded area for only women. And by the age of 13, when she got married to her legal guardian and cousin, who was 40 years above her age, forcefully Ali Sharawi, she became really frustrated that her education stopped while her brothers continued, and her brothers was a lot better. And so her first introduction to politics came through her husband. And once she started learning about the political way that Egypt worked, she became interested in this call for equal education. From a very early age, Huda rejected harem society and became really interested in organizing public activities for women, like lectures. And after organizing these little lectures and community groups, she recognized how en masse women's participation in social, public, and just general world affairs could greatly improve society. And she was like, why isn't this happening right now? So Shaarawi argued for women's liberation, starting with education, because she believed it would lead to full participation in all sorts of reform. So the next question is, what was Shaarawi's involvement in the Egyptian feminist movement? Huda Shaarawi, from a very early part of her activist lifestyle, she promoted social service projects. So in 1909, she established Mubarak Muhammad Ali, which was a women's social service organization. And she argued that women run social service projects were important for two reasons. A, they engaged women to widen their horizons and acquire practical real world knowledge that would direct their focus outwards out of the domestic sphere. And B, such projects would challenge the view that all women were creatures of pleasure and beings in need of protection by liberating themselves and creating and really helping themselves. However, after organizing the Union of Educated Women in 1914, a lot of criticism arose around Shaarawi because she had this sort of romanticized view of a poor woman's life. She believed that the rich were the guardians and protectors of the nation, whereas the poor were quiet recipients of the rich's care. So a lot of social Darwinistic ideals sprouted from Shaarawi's early life, and it's probably because most scholars believe that it is because she was raised as part of the Egyptian elite. At the same time, Shaarawi recognized the pivotal time period she was in because the British looked like they were leaving during and post World War I. There was a lot of decolonizing and a lot of nationalism was taking place with extreme calls, protests, and rallies for independence from Britain. Her work really accelerates between 1919 and 1925. So in 1919, Huda helped lead the first women's street demonstration, also known as the March of Veiled Women in Cairo, to protest British colonial rule and to foil a British plan that was meant to exile her husband, who was one of the 4 Egyptian nationalist leaders. Later that year, however, Huda's husband dies and she permanently removes her veil. Huda then works across class lines to demonstrate against British occupation of Egypt and to lead the Weftist Women's Central Committee, which is the Weft. It was a political party in opposition to the British occupied government. Huda became the president of this Weftist Women's Central Committee, but much to her dismay, as following independence 2 years later, the government denied suffrage, which was a forefront issue for Huda, aside from equal education. In 1922, after Egypt gained its nominal independence from Britain, Shaarawi carried on her resilient fight for women's rights. When the new government barred women from opening of the Egyptian parliament, Shaarawi led a delegation of women to picket the opening by holding out fences and standing in front of the government parliament, and relieving the interrelatedness of their feminist and nationalist beliefs. The protesters issued a list of 32 demands that consisted of feminist and social and nationalist beliefs. The Weftists, however, ignored her requests, and she decided out of frustration to step down from her role as president and form and devote the rest of her life to the Egyptian Feminist Union. So in 1923, Shaarawi founded and became the first president of the Egyptian Feminist Union, also known as the EFU. The EFU focused on various issues that were really important to Shaarawi, particularly women's suffrage, which is women's right to vote, to increase their participation in the political system, increase education for women, and changes in the personal status laws. One of the few things that the EFU was actually successful at was raising the marriage age to 16, which was a deeply personal issue for Shaarawi. While the EFU accomplished few of its goals in its existence, it's still alive today, but in its early existence, it is widely credited with setting the stage for later feminist victories. Also in 1923, a very pivotal moment happened that becomes the defining factor of Shaarawi's activism. After attending an international feminist meeting in Rome in 1923, Shaarawi cast her veil in a very public act outside of a Cairo train station. The hijab was already a very loaded symbol of the ideological and conflicts over culture, and it provided a collective identity in the Arab world. But Shaarawi's, in her radical act of unveiling, although she was merely removing a facial screen she used to wear, she was also dislodging a sort of symbolic barrier which impeded women's access to the public life. And she noted that by wearing the hijab in the first place, she had grounded herself already in Islam and Arabic culture. And therefore, she legitimized her demands for women's suffrage and women's liberation through Islam and claimed that she had the right to interpret that culture anew with authority and legitimacy. And although Shaarawi doesn't believe that this moment was that significant, this has become the most defining moment in her activism. Not too long after the EFU was launched, one of the first feminist journals, L'Egyptienne, in 1925 was created, and it was accessible to nearly all women, allowing them to en masse access critical and feminist and empowering writings. And it was accessible to all, and 2 years later it came out in Arabic, so it was a very prominent Egyptian feminist article and journal. The next question I have is, or the final one is, what was Shaarawi's legacy for the international feminist movement in the Arab world? A very important factor about Shaarawi's feminism is it called on feminist nationalism. Because despite men's initial discomfort with the notion of the liberation of women, it sought to intersectionality between nationalism and feminism, because it fit to a certain degree with men's image of themselves as civilized people modeling themselves after the civilized nations in post-colonial Egypt. This was an understandable strategy given the need to find common ground on which men and women could build a unified Egyptian nation state after colonial rule for so long by the British. It's important to acknowledge that Egyptian feminism and discourse and activism during this period of post-colonial state formation, and even up to the first half of the 20th century, have repeatedly been identified by Huda Shaarawi's work. It's important to note that her activism built on the efforts of women before her. Breaking away from Western feminism happened in the 1930s because although Huda took a lot of inspiration from women in Islam and looked to the works of Carrie Chapman Catt and Alice Paul in America, she removed women from the position of being defined solely in terms of her body and argued that women needed as a wider range of occupations as men. And she gained at first a very intellectual she took a lot of inspiration from first wave noted feminists. However, by the 1930s, she was increasingly influenced by the nationalist movement in Palestine, and Shaarawi began to define her nationalism in pan-Arab terms. And this conflicted with Western feminism because Huda became suspicious of these Western feminists because of their Zionist beliefs in support of Israel. So in 1945, Huda breaks away from the Western feminist social circle and she founds the All-Arab Feminist Union. Her legacy is very grand. Shaarawi continued to lead the national feminist movement and extended the fight to other Arab countries. By 1945, almost 2 years before her death at 68, Shaarawi received the highest decoration from the Egyptian state. It's also called the Nishan al-Kamal, for services rendered to the country. But even as the state recognized her for her dual struggle for gender equality and national liberation, it withheld from her political right. And it was a symbol of contradictions which she and other women had to live with because they didn't have the right to vote until 1956. While there are controversies about the nature of the feminist voice presented by Shaarawi, scholars have cautioned that to understand her feminism and activism, one must consider the context of anti-colonial and anti-imperial struggle. As such, we can see that Shaarawi did not abandon Islam, but was acting within and reacting against a complex web of considerations. Specifically, Shaarawi sought to create a new Egyptian national identity, a new cultural or social identity that provides the only corrective to the invisibility of women as living, breathing, contributing, and participating members of the social and political community that is based on shared value system grounded in the Islamic virtues of egalitarianism, honesty, personal virtue, and the fulfillment of social duty and hard work. Among the other tensions she had to negotiate was the accusation that the feminist movement was too westernized and therefore inauthentic, but we know that by the late 1930s and obviously by 1945, Huda broke away from the Western feminist movement, and she represented Egypt at women's congresses all across the world. She was instrumental in 1944 in convening the first Arab Feminist Union, which called for solidarity with the Arabs of Palestine. And she also proposed, outside of her feminist movement, the internationalization of the Suez Canal, and shortly before her death, the abolition of nuclear weapons. Even if only some of her demands were actually met during her lifetime, she laid the groundwork for later gains by Egyptian women like Doria Shafik and Nawal al-Saadawi, who were both Egyptian feminists and suffragettes who really worked and were able to accomplish the right to vote in Egypt. The big idea is that the modern Arab feminist movement wouldn't be the same without Shaarawi's incredible activism and political involvement in the pivotal post-colonial era of 1920s Cairo. Shaarawi is seen as a key contributor to the modern Egyptian nation state, and her contribution to Arab feminisms has many conflicting faces. Nevertheless, I believe that her role and her leadership have to be acknowledged as pioneering, complex, contradictory, and invaluable. She is remembered today as one of the most prominent Arab feminists, and she saw the struggle for independence in Egypt and the struggle for women's emancipation as inseparable and interdependent, which is very interesting. So thank you. And the sources I used were L'Egyptienne, which is her feminist and sociological journal, The Harem Years, which is her biography, and just a couple of other journals. If you want to contact me, here's my email, and that's it. Thank you.